Hey Sunrise, welcome to the Sunrise Zapier app new invoice trigger demonstration video. I am in the midst of beginning a new Zap here, and I have selected Sunrise for the triggering step, and I am selecting the new invoice trigger. So we'll hit continue. We've got to log into our account as always, and we must select, as in all of our Sunrise apps, an organization to associate this trigger to. So this is a list of all of the organizations that I have created in my Sunrise user account that I just signed in with. I'm going to select this one called Lendio at the top. So essentially what we're saying is anytime a new invoice is created for this organization Lendio in Sunrise, that's when we're going to fire off this Zap. We have a couple options here. You'll notice that they're not required. One is invoice state and one is invoice is paid. So we can narrow down the invoice selection of this trigger by the invoice state, which means draft approved or voided. Or we can narrow it down even further with is the invoice paid or not, which essentially means that if we had marked invoice is paid is true, the only time this would trigger is if an invoice's status is paid and vice versa. But we'll just leave that blank. We want them all to be included. So we'll go ahead and click continue. We're going to test our trigger to make sure that we got an invoice data object back. And we did. And look at all this data we get back. We get the invoice specific information. We have a lot of contact information that is associated with the invoice itself. And so we are going to go ahead and use all this good data that just came back from our Sunrise app to map to an action. And in this case, once again, so I can show you sort of all the features, we're going to map it to a bookkeeping application for our action. We're going to select Xero once again. If you've seen any of our other demo videos, you're probably getting very familiar with Xero. We're going to choose an action event, and we're going to go ahead and choose create sales invoice. So once again, just a little recap. What we're saying here is whenever we create a new invoice in Sunrise with that organization that we selected, we are going to create a new invoice in our Xero application. Cool. So we'll just go ahead and click continue, sign into our Xero account, click continue. So we are looking for a contact name to map to their invoice. And why don't we just search that contact? So we have contact person name, but I think we're looking for the contact name in this case, which is Nintendo. So if you haven't seen any of our contact videos yet, a contact can have many contact persons. So if you think of a contact, it can be an individual, but it can also be a company. So it could be AT&T, it could be Delta Airlines, it could be Nintendo, and then that contact, that business would have contact people that you want to contact, and then those are recognized as contact persons. And you could have multiple values for those contact persons. So we're going to select an email address to associate with this contact in Xero. This one, we are going to, the only emails that we have available are for our contact persons in our Sunrise contact. So we are going to have to format this to a single email address. And so how do we do that? We have to use one of these Zapier helpers. So we're going to add an intermediate step in between our trigger and our action, and we're going to use this helper called formatter. We're going to go down to this helper called utilities. And so if you read some of these labels, one of our choices would be numbers. We're not really working with numbers here, so automatically that's out. Utilities is the one that we are going to ultimately select, but let's check out some of these other options. So there's date time, working with dates and times, and text, working with text data to find and replace, capitalize, or remove HTML tags. That's not necessarily what we're doing. So let's select utilities and continue. So we are going to transform, and one of our options here is called pick from a list, and we're going to select pick from a list. And let me just go back to our action and let's get really clear on what we're trying to do. So the Xero action to create an invoice is asking for a single email address. but the data that our Sunrise trigger provided for emails is a comma separated list. There's two email addresses here. So what we need to do is we need to format this into a single email. And we are doing that with this helper. And we are saying we are going to choose something from our list of emails. And so we have options. We can choose the first one, we can choose the last one, or we can let this helper choose at random. So in this case, I'm going to assume that the first contact person's data that was entered into that contact, in this case Nintendo, is probably the primary contact. So I'm going to go ahead and choose first. And then we have to select the input from our Sunrise app data that we want to select from. So in our case, it is contact person's emails, and it's contact at nes.com is our first one. That's the one that we're hoping will be selected. And then the other one in this sample data case is Mario at nes.com. It's important to note, if we had created a contact in our Sunrise app that only had one contact person and only had one email, we would only see one email address here, and that may be misleading for us. It may lead us to believe that this value is not a list, but it is a singular value. In the case of having only one email address with that sample data, that trigger probably, or that zap wouldn't fail. But in the case that as you create more and more and different contacts with different numbers of contact persons, this would potentially fail. So we do need to select something from this field. So we could put a default optional value if there's no items to be chosen. So in the event that Sunrise sent over a contact that didn't have any contact persons associated with it, and they didn't have an email address, we could put a default value here that would return every time that there failed to be any data there. We're just going to leave that blank for now. Let's go ahead and test that helper. And we got what we were looking for. We got a single email address, and it's the correct one. It was the first one in the list. And if any of this is a little confusing, or you want to have a little more practice with these helpers and this utilities helper specifically, Zapier has great help docs that can help you figure out how to get your data in the right shape for whatever application you're mapping your data to. So the next step, of course, is we go to that email address and we need to map our results to it. Just double populate it. Let's not do that. Cool. So our contact name is Nintendo. Our email address is contact at NES. For this 0, we need to choose a status. We're just going to leave that blank because it's not required. And this is not a 0 demo necessarily. The date defaults to creation date, so we can map some information from our Sunrise here. Created time, we are looking for invoice created time. Beautiful. A due date, let's see if we have a due date in our Sunrise. Due date, invoice due date. Cool. Let's see, currency defaults to the organization. We'll leave that blank. We'll leave the URL blank for now, just for the sake of brevity. Branding theme, this is essentially this is an app-specific field for 0. We have something like this in our Sunrise app. It's called template. So if I did have multiple themes in my 0 app, they'd be listed here, and I could select which one I'd like. And themes are just, styles, different fonts, different colors, that sort of thing. Our invoice number is not required here. I'm going to leave it blank because it'll auto-generate. And that's something, if we did search, we probably could find an invoice number. Let's see if here we go, invoice number. The invoice that we just created, our invoice number is blank. But the issue would be that our invoice numbers for Sunrise wouldn't probably map properly to 0. So it is probably best that we leave that because that sounds pretty app specific. An additional reference number, we don't use that in Sunrise, and so we won't map that to our 0 invoice. And I think you get the gist. So sent to contact, if that value did exist. So with 0, we can select true or false there. We're going to leave it blank because it's not required. Here we go. We're getting down to our line items. So now we need to add our invoice lines from Sunrise. So the first one is our line item type. It's not a field that we map, it's a field that we select here. We're going to leave this blank. These are app specifics for 0. Line item code. We must provide either an item code or both a line item description and line unit price. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to provide those two values instead of that line item code because we're not really sure what that is in reference to. That is a 0 app specific field. So let's see if there's something that we can map to from our 0 invoice data to line description. And remember, we're looking for line items, so it's going to be in the form of a list. So let's just type description, and we'll see it says lines description, Koopa Troopa, Flower Power, Fire Booster. That is description of each line item. So this is a good point. This is a confusing thing that happens in a lot of applications. It's a pattern that you're going to see a lot. If you notice that description of each line item, it is a list, but it is not the list that we want. So this is the item and the item description. And if you notice, the lines description is a list of the actual descriptions themselves. So be careful, look at your sample data and look at the data that would map most closely to the value that you're looking for. So we're going to select lines description and lines plural there. We're going to look for quantity. This one should be pretty easy. Lines quantity. I keep hitting these twice. Unit price for the line, we're definitely going to want to find that. So let's look if we have a unit price. Lines unit price, cool. And you'll notice because these are lines, there's 2 comma separated values here, 2 comma separated values here, 2 comma separated values here, and so on. Line discount percentage, we're going to skip that one for 9. This one, line account code. This would be mapping an account code to each line. These are app specific, so 1200 in 0 points to accounts receivable, but there's no guarantee that whatever line code that we may have in Sunrise would map to the same account in 0, so it's probably best that we leave that blank. Line tax type, this is also app specific. So these are all the tax types that I have associated with my 0 account. So we couldn't really map anything specific from our Sunrise account because 0 wouldn't understand that value that we'd be mapping. So it says only specify this if you want to override the default tax type for the account code above. So we're going to leave all of that blank and just see if we have a successful invoice created here from 0. And looks like we do. We got a invoice back. This is all the information that we mapped to our new 0 invoice. And so now when we turn this Zap on, every time we create an invoice in Sunrise, we will also create an invoice in 0. And that is the basics of the new invoice trigger in Sunrise.